Good morning, everybody, and happy Valentine's Day. Welcome to our 47th webinar for ConnectedLearning.tv. I'm Mimi Ito, and I'm the Research Director of the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub at UC Irvine. This is the fourth and last webinar in the mini-series we've been doing that was timed in tandem with the release of our Connected Learning report last month. So we're very pleased to be having as our closing guests for this mini-series Kris Gutierrez and Bill Penuel, who are part of the Connected Learning Research Network. Just a few details before we dive into our main program. For those of you on live stream, we encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourselves, connect with each other, also share resources, and most importantly, to pose questions, which we will do our very best to try to address here in the Google Plus Hangout. We also have a new Connected Learning community also on Google Plus, where we've had almost 500 people join in less than a month. So we're having some really interesting and lively conversations there, and really encourage you to join and contribute to the discussion there as well, and not just in the hour of our webinar. And finally, there will be a URL posted in the live stream chat that will be a link to a set of group notes in a Google Doc. So this is a place to just start sharing, curating, and gathering up some of the discussion and resources that people are sharing in relation to today's topic. And speaking of today's topic, today we'll be talking about some of the research that Kris and Bill are doing in relation to connected learning, and maybe more specifically having a focused discussion on the question of what success looks like and how you can measure it in relation to connected learning, a really interesting and challenging and important topic for all of us who are interested in working and promoting in the area of connected learning. So before I turn it over to Kris and Bill, as is our custom with these Hangouts, I wanted to let our other Hangout participants introduce themselves and say a little bit about their own interest in relation to the topic that brings us here this morning. So let me turn it over. Ugochi, do you want to get us started?
Sure. My name is Ugochi Achalanu. I am a postdoc out at DePaul University, and I'm looking to make game-based assessments around connected learning principles. So I'm really trying to understand what kind of outcomes that we want to capture, and how do we do it in a way that highlights both the situation and the individual at the same time.
Thanks, Ugochi. It's great to have you here. Lisa?
Gutierrez at CU Boulder, and I'm really interested and have been for a long time at how we can design for learning and also for assessment that helps show the resources that students from non-dominant communities bring into classrooms and other learning settings, and also to help teachers have assessments where they don't feel like they have to create these kinds of boxed in trajectories for students. So I think those two things go together, and I'm excited to hear more about what everybody's doing.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And Julie?
I'm Julie Kane, and I'm a Senior Research Associate at VIF International Education, and I do a lot of work around teacher education around global inquiry. And we've been engaging teachers in collective inquiry, so I'm looking at assessing teacher learning around that, as well as student learning, very similar to what you just described, around global competence, which is around assessing curiosity and sharing perspective and empathy. And these are very difficult things to assess in a classroom. So I'm also looking at that.
Great. Thanks so much, Julie. It's great to have you here. So today I'm really delighted to be able to be in conversation with Bill Penuel and Kris Gutierrez. I'm very lucky to have them as colleagues in the Connected Learning Research Network, where they both are principal investigators of their own projects. Bill is a professor in educational psychology and the learning sciences in the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder, and Kris is professor of literacy and learning sciences and holds the inaugural provost chair at the University of Colorado Boulder as well. So I think Kris is going to kick us off in this conversation by talking a little bit about her research project and how she understands connected learning. So Kris, take it away.
Well, thank you, Mimi. It's great to be here with you on Valentine's Day, since we love this project. I've been thinking about connected learning, although I've called it different things. I think over the course of my career, really trying to think about ways to make learning more meaningful to people across the practices of their everyday lives. So one metaphor I think about when I think about connected learning is to think about learning as movement. Because especially when it comes to youth learning, our youth move across a range of contexts and produce artifacts that reflect the intercultural and hybrid and multimodal practices of which they are a part. And I think that those of us in connected learning are really interested in understanding better what takes hold as people move in and around these kinds of practices in ways that I think really challenges the way we've thought about previous conceptions of learning. So we're interested in the kinds of dispositions, the kinds of expertises, right, that develop as people move in and across these environments and these interests, including really focusing on just the act of boundary crossing and what kind of learning is involved when people move across these settings. And so for me, and I think many of us in this project, I know Bill for sure, is that we don't think of connected learning as bridging everyday and interest-driven practices so that they can become meaningful and just used somewhere else and then discarded. For me, the bridge metaphor just doesn't work, and that's why I like the learning as movement, because our understanding of learning is that everyday, interest-driven, and school-based, or whatever term you want to use, that real expansive forms of learning come about when people can really synthesize those, when there's a reorganization of the way we think about our everyday lives and the other kinds of expertises that are available to us in other settings. And so that has really led me to focus a lot on how do you design environments that that really leverage the kinds of what Barbara Rogoff and I call the repertoires of practice. Now, my work has really been focused on working with youth from non-dominant communities, and generally the operant paradigms around deficit. What don't they know? And I think connected learning really helps us push on those in really important ways, because we're not so interested, it's not very useful, at least not from a learning and a design perspective, to simply focus on what people don't know. It's much more useful to understand people's history of involvement in practices, right? The kinds of interest, dispositions, and expertise that are developed in those practices. And so we've used that as a way to think about designing environments. And so one of my settings is a long-standing model, previously known as, in some circles, the fifth dimension. Ours is a permutation of that, in which I have tried to use designing for connected learning by having undergraduates participate at the university in courses where they're deeply understanding learning and in particular the relationship of culture and learning, and then having them work with youth in a technology-saturated learning environment. And what we're interested in with both the undergraduate and the young children in those settings is how do people leverage the tools and practices from one setting to another? And that has led us to a really exciting project, thanks to MacArthur, to do something that we always wanted to do, and that is to follow the children from these design learning environments into their homes and other settings to really examine and to both theorize and to think about what tools and practices travel, what dispositions and what forms of expertise travel, and how do we know it when we see it, right? Which has always been the challenge for us. And so in our study, we're trying to develop a set of more ecologically valid tools that really capture people's everyday practices and the meanings that they hold for people, as well as how people develop expertise. So we're interested in both processes as well as the production of artifacts in those settings. So in our work, we have really relied on what we hope are more ecologically valid tools, like understanding people's daily practices, the social networks of which they're a part, using documenting moment-to-moment kinds of interactions to really give us thick descriptions of how people participate and make sense of their participation in practices. And just finally, that has also given me the opportunity to work with curricular development around work I call syncretic approaches to learning, in which we're designing curriculum which explicitly leverages everyday and school-based kind of expertise in ways that really challenge that dichotomy. And it's one of the most exciting things I'm doing. I'm partnering with people in the Connected Learning Project, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to talk about that more.
Sure.
Great,
So,
thanks so much, Kris. I mean, I really appreciate your way of framing some of the metaphors and ways that we think about the connected learning model, because I think it can be interpreted in so many different ways, especially, you know, this idea that it's not about fixing kids and this deficit model, but it really is about saying, you know, what are they bringing to the table, and moving away from that deficit model is so important if we're really serious about the equity agenda and the connected learning work. You're getting a lot of love on the live stream for that too. Must be Valentine's Day. So Bill, I'd love to hear, you know, a bit of what you've been working about and thinking about, and you know, how you're thinking about this outcomes and assessment question as well.
great. Well, happy Valentine's Day, everyone, first. And maybe I'll just build a little bit on this metaphor of learning as movement, movement across different spaces, and also the idea that in connected learning, what young people are doing is leveraging the kinds of repertoires of practice in one setting into another, going deeper, expanding their possibilities for action. And I think that really is one set of issues that frames the challenge of assessing learning outcomes in connected learning. The other, Ugochi alluded to, which is the idea of choice. So one of the things that is both a challenge but also, I think, an opportunity to think hard about is how are the choices that young people make about the activities they choose to join, as well as their choices about how they choose to transform their participation within activities where there are opportunities to do so. That these actually are the moments that we can think about as opportunities to assess how young people are learning. And so, you know, the very first sets of questions, and I think I'll switch to a screen share here to that I think are useful to answer. Are set of big questions about just who participates, who comes to, and when I'm saying participates here, one of the focal points for assessment of a lot of connected learning environments are these designed environments like the fifth dimension. And one of the challenges is just to remember that this is just one place that we could be looking at learning. And so the kinds of methodologies that Kris is talking about are really important. But we also know that people who get funding for their design environments have to answer questions like this, which are who's coming to the place that I'm organizing? Who participates often? Why do people come back? Why do people stop coming? And I want to call out too that most programs or designed environments have intentions about who will come. They may have a goal to reach non-dominant communities. So really assessing who's coming and whether we're reaching the people that we hope to reach systematically and consistently and sustaining their interest is an equity question that we want to keep to the fore. And the other question we can look at, and we can get at this largely through observing people, is what do they do? What happens to young people when they come to an environment that we've set up? Space is really important in connected learning. So in the learning labs, in U-Media, part of what really is powerful is the reorganization of space in libraries and museums that enable different forms of engagement along maybe your Homago model. So from hanging out, messing around, and geeking out. So the organization of space really enables some of the fluid movement that Kris is talking about between different forms of participation. So attending to that is an important question we can answer. And then, drawing on Barbara Rogoff's framework, one of the questions that she says that we should really ask when we are evaluating development and as transformation of participation is, how did young people's participation involvement change over time? And a big question I think is to ask is, do they go deep? Do they develop expertise around their interests? Because it's great if young people can move fluidly and enjoy spaces, for example, for hanging out and messing around. But what we also hope to see is some of that geeking out, some of that going deep into an interest that a young person pursues. And then, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, having the supports that enable that young person to go deeper and develop new knowledge and skill. And then, of course, the formative evaluation question that's really important to ask young people themselves is, what do young people wish they could do here that they can't? And one of the modes of engagement that we can engage young people themselves, and I hope maybe some people will speak up about this, is in research that they do themselves in their own inquiry into their environments. And one of the things that we're doing in our connected learning research study, which is a longitudinal study, is where my colleagues Ben Kirshner and Adam York have developed some resources for youth participatory action research and are convening a group of nationally distributed youth researchers to investigate their own design learning environments that are connected learning environments. And they're asking these sorts of questions of one another and of other youth in their programs. I alluded to this study that we're doing in our work, and it's a longitudinal survey that's a survey study of connected learning outcomes that I'm supported really deeply by my colleagues at SRI, led by Vera Michalczyk. And one of the things that we're looking at is we're looking at a range of much broader outcomes than just academic outcomes. We are looking at those, at least self-reported grades in the study. What we've done is we've recruited about 30 sites from around the world, from the English-speaking world anyway, mostly in the United States, that are design learning, connected learning environments. And then we have about between 15 and 50 or so young people who are responding to a survey that's in the field right now. We'll be following up with them in about a year and a half. And we're looking at these outcomes they're very different from your traditional school outcomes. One is school-like in the sense that we're asking them, how attached are you to the kinds of conventional or prosocial institutions that we do want young people to care about? We want them to be connected to school. We want them to see a match of where they're able to leverage the interests in connected learning in school in what they consider to be their best subjects. But we also just want young people to be connected, to have a sense of that they have a network of people that help them stay on track, plan for the future, and navigate these different worlds and boundary crossing moments that all young people have to navigate. We want young people to have a positive sense of the future, so we're looking at that. Do young people have a sense of hopefulness, an orientation to the future that they're planning for it, a plan for continuing a pursuit of education, a sense of social place or integration? That is, this is the sort of ways in which connected learning is peer supported, having friends that are engaged also and help sustain their engagement. And then one of the outcomes that comes out of the Youth Participation in Politics Network is the idea that connected learning leads to greater civic engagement. And so we're looking at whether young people who are part of these design learning environments that are trying to foster connected learning actively participate in civic and political institutions. So, and I just want to briefly mention to this report that as a resource for people who are doing this work, that Jay Lemke, Robert LeCousset, Vera Michalczyk, and Michael Cole produced for MacArthur that is around reporting, assessing learning. And they make some very specific recommendations around this. And I just say this to invite you to look at that. They, like us, they really recommend their top priority is to broaden the scope of outcomes that we're looking at to encompass social, emotional, and developmental outcomes. But equally important is we don't just look at the level of the individual. That's important. But we can also look at outcomes at the group level, like mutual support or challenge, and at the project or community level. So what extent are we creating a climate that's positive of social and emotional development? I know Kris wanted to add something too here, so let me get it back.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, I can do
Yeah, Bill, just, I'll wait till we get back to the screen.
this one.
Oh, no.
Yeah, sorry.
Just to your video. So Bill just reminded me of something that I thought was really relevant that I wanted to add to, because sooner than later. And that is that one of the challenges for those of us who've been doing largely ethnographic work, using qualitative approaches to our work, always run into the challenge. Tell us more about how you can talk about those forms of expertise. So one of the things that we are doing that really grows out of my work with Barbara Rogoff, who's been doing this for many, many years, is that we know we collect kind of deep ethnography about the repertoires of practice that youth develop. And so we learn about a particular expertise or phenomena that we want to assess more deeply. For example, in our studies, we're finding that joint activity is a really important way of organizing learning around new media with our families. So very quickly, what we're doing is that we're designing what we're calling ecologically valid design experiments that actually will test out in novel ways whether our hunches, whether the learning that we're doing from our ethnography really does bear out in these more bounded kinds of studies. And so I think that's going to be an important contribution, so that when we say we're seeing this and we can document it richly from our qualitative work, we're finding that we want to now design, again, a more controlled experiment in the new sense that we're talking about, to really test out those assumptions and be able to talk in much richer ways about the outcomes that we're seeing from our qualitative work.
This is an important movement too, and I want to underscore the fact that when we developed our survey for this study, we really drew on the rich ethnographies of Kris and Mimi and others in the first sort of round of work to develop the and also worked out of the synthesis to develop the constructs and think about how we measure them. So there's really a complementary approach, and I think it does have to begin with the deep look at what people are doing before you can kind of undertake the kind of survey effort that I'm doing for the network.
So I maybe just had to insert that because it was...
No, that's good. And we have the benefit of you two to have some dialogue. So, Bill, were you done with your...
I was, yeah. I just
okay.
want to just get us launched, and then hopefully we can have some dialogue. I know some people have requested that report, and I don't know where that link exists.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're in the process of, getting it into dissemination ready form. So hopefully we can share that
appetite, but they
that's good. That's the it's the trailer.
Okay.
But yeah, I will also endorse the report. It's a really great synthesis of a lot of the current thinking around how to do assessment and documentation in these more informal kinds of environments, which is a huge challenge. And it has both the broad framework as well as a lot of practical stuff in it too. So I wanted to invite some of our other guests in the Hangout to jump into the conversation. Julie, did you have a question or a topic you wanted to raise?
So again, my head is really in the sort of the teachers. I'm thinking a lot of my work with when teachers really try to do some of the learning that you describe is getting them to sort of take back assessment. That seems to be a lot of my work lately, is reminding teachers that assessment is in their power. Because I think it's been taken away from them. It's been taken away from their practice. And so they're struggling with the how do I know it when I see it? Because what testing has done has really taken the really important part of learning, which is assessing learning, and teachers have a very intuitive way of knowing when they see it, but they don't document it. So they are really rich ethnographers, actually. So I can really sit one-on-one with a teacher and have these rich discussions, and it's the documentation and the reporting and them being able to a little bit formalize some of the assessment of the real learning they see, as opposed to just the sort of end of year testing that they're sort of restricted by. So I don't know what my question is there, but really about how do you get teachers to kind of assess the way they know they want to assess, as well as having to navigate these political environments that they're in. I mean, there's no way around it. They have to do both. And I'm trying to help teachers do both.
So I think one thing that is going to be a contribution that we can make when we are doing these kinds of ecologically valid experiments in the home or just from our ethnographic research is that we can show how in families assessment happens through relationships. Mm-hmm. I think this is really important if we want to bring back these kinds of effective domains, that teachers, like when you say intuitive, an intuitive part of assessment is having a relationship with a student. Yeah. And when you have these kinds of, you know, testing 1 week kinds of situations, that's obviously like as far as you can get from relationships. So I think us foregrounding that in our research, how that happens in home spaces and informal spaces is going to be, hopefully, really helpful for people.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to add is many of the connected learning design environments engage young people in the activities of design. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's naturally embeddable into design are critical standards by which peers and teachers engage in joint critique of one another's work. Mm-hmm. I mean, crit is a natural embedded practice in design work. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in general, we want to try to leverage in informal settings the evaluative practices that already go on and say, what can we draw from that? Are there standards, critical standards emerging in this group, this project? Can we document them? Are there artifacts that allow us to rate or characterize the qualities of the work that young people are doing? Mm-hmm. And so in general, that's a general strategy, but also a very specific one, the kinds of rubrics and crit processes that we might integrate. Mm-hmm. Or might be integrated into settings.
And that can be done a variety of ways through the social network platforms in which you have youth are learning in those practices how to do that as part of the design process, as well as more formal ways of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So much of my work, I'm always in kind of the formal institutions, and a lot of it, you know, they have certain things that they really want the kids to know because they feel it's important, and we know we want them to know it, but it's so hard to do these very in-depth ecological kind of assessments with 30 students in one classroom or changing over time. So I'm trying to think about what does that mean for allowing teachers to do more formative assessments so they can kind of assess their own kind of instruction and how that's interacting with students with these different backgrounds, because you know, intelligence is not fixed. So it's hard for, and I'm still struggling with that as I'm designing my own assessments. How do you make meaningful assessments that are usable in the design of school right now? Because it's easy to fall back on these paper and pencil tests because they're there versus, you know. So I don't know if there's any kind of suggestions or any kind of ways about thinking about this in terms of causing this kind of transformation in how we assess and how we use assessment and how we think about assessment.
Mm-hmm. One thing I think is really important to focus folks' attention on in schools is how much the success in school depends on a whole range of things supports that are available to young people out of school and around school. And I think demonstrating the value of connected learning is partly saying, well, let's really unpack, you know, who's resilient in this setting, who might otherwise be struggling, who is making do and thriving, you know, under tight circumstances. And when you start to unpack that, you know, part of that takes you to help convince school people, wow, there's a whole lot of brokering going on. There's a whole lot of mentoring going on that's not captured by instruction and the instruction that's going on. So I think part of demonstrating the value add has to be to point to cases of resilience and to show people, like, look, this is explained not by what's happening just in the classroom, but by what we might call the phenomena or features of connected learning.
Yeah, and I think for us that relates to kind of some overarching questions we have with our novice teachers, and that's always, how do I know? And invoking the principle of understanding things across a minimum of 2 contexts or 2 practices. And so one of the things that has really helped us help teachers leverage those ethnographic eyes that they have, right? Yes. Is to have them work with youth, or at least observe youth across different settings. Preferably one of these design settings that has more affordances, more tools available and forms of support, and then maybe a more traditional setting, and not to compare and contrast or to demonize one or privilege the other, but rather to help them really explore the question, what is it about the way learning is organized here and here? What is it about the way space is organized, the tools available and practices that allows Bill to do this over here and maybe not here? And it's that kind of sensibility that really has helped our teachers really start to leverage I think the rich set of practices that they are already used to using, but helping them make more rich kind of formative assessments.
And I would also add there, just for the in terms of working with pre-service, is also the language for teachers to use. So sometimes teachers can see it, but they don't have it's almost a metacognitive thing of the language of that assessment, of what that learning is. So a lot of times they'll know it when they see it, but they can't really talk about it. So it's this intuitive, it's based on that relationship they have with that kid, but then broadly talking about what that learning is, they have less grasp of a standardized language for it. And maybe they don't need a standardized language, but I think it is that leveraging of that ethnography to a broader audience that I think is what I'm thinking of.
I have a question. So I think this is for Bill, but also for all of you. So in some research that I did with the classroom, we did collaborative rubrics and self-assessment. So the collaborative rubric helped both the teacher and the students get the language from their different locations, basically, how you might assess on like a social network, or how you might assess in the classroom. So I think that helped everyone move towards what they wanted to produce. So when you were talking about these kind of critical design features, is that the kind of activity that...
Yeah, so in addition to being embedded, I think what you're talking about, Lisa, is this ideal of transparency in assessment. And that's actually an ideal from the design of assessment, is that if I'm going to hold you to account for something, you should be aware of the standards by which I'm making those judgments. And then the formative assessment literature points to the real value of involving young people in self-assessment as a moment of formative assessment, because you begin to own those standards and make use of them yourself to judge the qualities of your participation or the products that you're making.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and I think part of what we're trying to do with building out this connected learning model is to start building a shared vocabulary and a set of standards, for lack of a better term, for that kind of transparency. So like we say, oh, connections between in school and out of school, but what does that really look like? And to be more granular and concrete, because I think, like, as an ethnographer or a teacher who's embedded in it, we do have that intuitive sense, but there's something about that transparency and reification that becomes really critical for those of us working in more informal environments to get clear on, so other people can, we can rally around the same things. Kind of to that point, there's a question in the live stream about this issue of connections, which I think is a question for Kris, from Tim Lord, who's been doing some great work at DreamYard with youth. Oftentimes it seems that young people don't make connections between environments and across communities. How do we encourage them to remember to make those connections, and how do we build that in?
Well, one response for me is that we design for it, right? I think that's really important. And so I think that what happens is, as you just said, our practices are so normative, they're invisible to us, and so it's real hard for youth, especially people in general, but youth especially, to kind of really make that everyday or interest-driven practice an object of reflection and understanding. So one of the things that I think is that's so important in some of these settings that we're doing is that we're making those everyday and interest-driven practice the object of analysis, the object of activity, and so people become much more aware of their everyday practices. I think that to expect youth to make those connections without having some kind of meta-awareness and reflection about the very practice, not only the very practices in which they're engaged, but the value and usefulness of those practices and how they can be leveraged across spaces, right? So for me, that's a really important first order step before I can just make them naturally want to connect it to school or other places.
Right. I think it can't be on young people themselves just to make these connections. I mean, if we look at our own lives, probably the way we made it, we moved successfully from one setting to another and deepened our own learning, was probably because someone encouraged us to see something that we didn't see for ourselves, told us about some opportunities that we didn't know about, or maybe even made brokered an introduction to someone that enabled us to make that movement. So I think this is partly about expanding the role of the educator, if you will, whether that's a classroom teacher or someone in an informal setting where young people are learning design. It's really about forming a developmental alliance with a young person, not just teaching them something in that setting, but saying, my job is to do more than teach here. It's to say where to envision that person's future and sort of help bring them into it and do much more than just instruct.
And for me, I think that this is where kind of our notions of learning are really evolving, that we're really pushing back on the way we dichotomize out of school and in school or everyday and school-based practices. And we have some language that we're using to talk about it, right? We'll say that schools privilege vertical forms of expertise, that is kind of deepening your knowledge about a particular disciplinary domain, and we're all for that. But I think what people don't understand is that real meaningful learning is when you can examine that and understand that across domains, across contexts, across settings, and you might think about that as horizontal forms of learning. And I'm just thinking of Bill and I, who are such boundary crossers. We live such interdisciplinary worlds, and that's because we knew that to understand the phenomenon that we're interested in, we had to move across these intellectual, theoretical, methodological, and other kinds of spaces. And the same thing is true for our youth, right? And that if we can start thinking as educators that this expanding, giving people a chance to kind of deepen their understanding about disciplinary knowledge or other kinds of knowledge across these settings in a variety of ways, that we're actually not pulling away from the kind of rigor that we're expected in schools, but actually we're really pushing beyond those standards and the ways we think about learning. So that would be, I think, a really revolutionary move on our part, I think, if we could get that accomplished.
I think one of the things that your comments trigger for me too is the work we're trying to do in talking about both individual and collective outcomes. I think the vertical and horizontal is sort of one part of that. I think also just the fact that so much of our formal assessments have been individualized. And in the report, we're really trying to argue that you can't talk about individual outcomes separate from the collective outcomes. And I think that has resonance for people, but I think it's also really challenging for people to say, oh, well, if you're looking at collective outcomes, what are you really looking for? And I was wondering if either of you could speak to that.
Sure. So one of the things I think about is the functioning of teams and how well they organize and leverage the diversity of expertise. So Kris was talking about horizontal expertise. And I think about how design work at the company IDEO is organized. So IDEO is a design firm, and they design both stuff and processes. And people who are, what they do is they organize design processes that really try to encourage divergent thinking and have people bring expertise from seemingly irrelevant project work from the past. And what really makes it work is that divergent and expert thinking, as well as the leveraging the horizontal, moving the knowledge across context, is what really matters. And so we can think of teams as really doing that better, or either more or less effectively, by the creativity that they expose. And these are really important 21st century skills. This is something our schools don't do very well, but that the world of work is going to demand of is already demanding of all of us, to be able to do this boundary crossing and leveraging horizontal expertise in exactly these ways. And it's in the group context that we can think about, and in their organization that we can study the processes that either support that or hinder that.
And I seem to be quoting my dear friend Barbara Rogoff a lot this morning, but she has a real useful metaphor, I think, for helping us think about this. And she's written this wonderful article on 3 planes of analysis. But the shorthand for that is that, we have artificially separated out the individual from the collective, right? But the important point is that these are always mutually influencing all the time in ongoing ways. So we just separate them out analytically, we separate them out and through our testing and assessment, but they're always mutually informing. And I think that's a really important point to think about, and that what we can then do is say, so let's design forms of assessment that help us understand these relations, and that is we can focus on individual changes, but we can also focus on interpersonal or group changes, right, as well as organizational changes, because as an individual is learning, so is the organization. So I think we can find, and Bill's already done a lot of this work in his network kind of analysis, but I think that's really useful, so we don't get seduced into thinking that somehow what happens at the individual level has no relation to what's happening at the other levels in that context.
Right. Yeah, so one metric I think that you're alluding to is just the idea of what's the sharing network look like, of how people help one another in an organization. How rich and dense is that network? Are there people who are isolated and who don't have access to help to do the things that they need to do in their organization? So social network analysis is a really powerful tool for identifying strengths, people who are the go-to people in organizations and who are really key to helping in an organization and its functioning.
And of course, the classroom is an organization.
Right.
So,
right, and that's what's very, very interesting, is if you start looking at both of those things, there are definitely environments that can lead to very high performance for individuals that are very bad on the collective dimension. So I think that's where, as educators, we have to really ask ourselves those hard questions, that if you're pushing individual competitive achievement at the expense of other kinds of contribution and values, that we're not actually creating healthy collective systems. And ideally you want both of those to be functioning at a very high level, where individuals are realizing their potential but also making contributions back to the collective that elevates everybody, rather than a zero-sum kind of competitive equation. I think that's really what we've been pushing for, and we've been getting a lot of questions about the equity agenda, but I think at the core is this issue that, can we design learning that's about building capacity and elevating everybody, not about competing for scarce resources? And that's our big reason for, you push it into the technicalities of what you're looking at. There's really practical things you can do. I mean, when I've been looking at these issues from the point of view of these more youth-driven, participatory, and culture environments, to borrow Henry Jenkins' term, and environments like interest groups that are very high functioning, have high standards, where everybody's contributing and getting better together, they have certain kinds of collective properties that I think are very important valuable to look at and are often in tension with this idea of competitive individual achievement. And I think in school environments, you're getting the dynamic from a slightly different direction where group projects and collective projects can be really challenging in an environment that places a high value on individual outcomes and excellence that's measured at the individual layer. Ugochi, I know you've been looking at some of these dynamics in terms of collaboration within the school environment, and I was curious if you had any sort of on-the-ground insights on some of this.
Sorry, so it's been interesting being in a school. I'm in one of the Quest to Learn schools and trying to look at how they try to create this connected learning environment. And when you particularly, I look at their activities and what situations do they put the kids in and what expectations of participation do they allow the kids to do. So one of the key activities I like to do is something they have called box level, which kind of tries to create this hybrid kind of an activity where there is school learning. So their last box level, they had to build Rube Goldberg machines using kind of simple machine principles. But then they also had the whole kind of, you need to organize yourself and figure out how to do this by yourself. So they really have the kids trying to create shared systems of contribution by kind of allowing the kids to kind of make their own groups and teams, but they all had to work together to finish this really challenging project. And you can kind of see where kids were bringing different models of kind of what is collaboration and what is leadership. You had people who were kind of thinking of it as a kind of entrepreneurial kind of thing, where they were kind of the leaders of a group and they would tell people what to do. You had people thinking of it as more of a kind of football team metaphor. And so they had different kind of like views about what it means to be part of the group and what it means to be a contributing member. That means giving your best and following orders versus kind of experimenting and trying to kind of figure out what was the best method to go to. So you had these kind of divergent ideas about what it means to be a collaborator and what it means to be a team player and what it means to be a leadership, and they all kind of converged into this one environment where there was a lot of hostility in some places, but a lot of kind of, after they figured out how people were relating, you could see some of the progress that they had in terms of working together and the value of collaboration versus and giving up their own kind of, I am the hero, I am the best person in the group, and trying to think about, okay, this is a team project, how do we get everybody involved and participating, because we can't do it by ourselves. And you kind of saw, when I kind of interviewed the kids afterwards about their experience, everybody said it was hard, but it wasn't the academic part that was hard. It was actually learning about other people. And there was a lot of students who were like, I never really knew, even though they were in the same classroom for the past like 4 or 5 months, they were like, I never really knew some of the people in my class until we did this environment, did this activity. And it really made me think about myself as a collaborator. When I get frustrated, what do I do and how do I interact and how do I get myself back down, and how do I interact with other people so they will be willing to work with me? So it's a kind of interesting dynamic where the learning goal was not really what can they produce and what do they know more about physics and simple machines, but it was more about what they learned about how to relate to one another without the formal instruction of a teacher. So the teachers were there, but they really actually let them control this whole situation. So it was a very interesting dynamic that I think will transfer outside of the school, because this is what they're going to have to deal with when they have to go into the workforce. There's not really one rule about how to have people contribute to a joint activity. So I thought that was a really interesting and novel approach to bringing both school learning and kind of out of school learning into one place. So, but how to assess that, that's a different story. So this is something I have to think about in terms of what would be an assessment to kind of highlight this value. I can see that on the ground, and I can interview students and talk about it, but a lot of what's going on in school is that pressure to get something out there. Parents want to know, how are their kids doing? And they want to know really quickly. They don't want to wait for however long. So what do you do to kind of support and show the progress that's being made in a way that is both meaningful and both kind of gives that understanding that it's a growing process. It's not a static thing. the situation and the student and everything that goes involved is coming about. So that's my hard. That's where I need to go.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I'm from New York City and my close friends are now parents at Quest to Learn, and I will say that the parents are a difficult pressure. And so I don't know if that's a part of the connected piece of how you work with parents and families in these design environments, because the difficulty with parents is they went to school, so they know all about it.
Yeah, so some of it is creating demand for different kinds of assessments among the parent community. A real model for me that I think of is that both of my children went through Reggio Emilia preschools. And there was an emphasis on documentation and pictures and narrative that went with the encounters. And then when my children went to public schools, that stopped, that flow of what's going on here. So part of it, I think, in creating the demand for different assessments is just making visible how are young people participating, all the things that we're talking about, making it so that parents are part of that, as opposed to we close the classroom door and then I think that's why people demand the numbers, the grades, is that they feel they don't have a steady stream of what their young people are doing, their children are doing in schools.
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that's particularly true when kids go to middle school. It's like you're just, it's a black hole. Anyway.
One thing I just wanted to pick up on that Mimi mentioned is the issue of equity. And I think that one of this notion of collective is really tied to designing for a collective is really tied not only to the way we think about learning, but also a really important equity issue. And I think that if I can at least talk for the work that Bill and Ben and Lisa and I have been trying to do, is that equity is part of the design from the onset. And often what happens in design interventions is that equity is a great rationale for saying we got to do this to help all kids, but then it gets lost in assessment, it gets lost in the way you're organizing. So a really important principle, I think, of connected learning is that equity is threaded across the processes, that our design processes, our assessments, the tasks we design, that it's really part and parcel of the way we think about doing this work, and it's not simply something that we take up, at the end or at the beginning.
Right, and so that means we have to assess it at some level.
That's right.
So when I was talking about who participates, are the people coming who we want, are we really reaching the people that we're intending to reach? But also that means assessing these collective opportunities to learn. The problem with the achievement gap literature is that at the end of the day, it really leads to individuals are still responsible for their own achievement. And we don't ask the question as well, did you have access to high quality instruction, to resources and materials that would have enabled you to achieve? Did you have a qualified teacher in your classroom? And the work that has been done where you actually go in and assess opportunity to learn shows that there's a very close relationship to those. But if we think about it, those are not part of our accountability systems. And so we have to make the assessment of equity of opportunity. And that's only one dimension. Leveraging diversity is another dimension of this assessment piece. So those are two things I think are essential to this, and they have to be part of any, not just assessment system, but it would be great if we're going to hold schools accountable, these have to be part of those systems too.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think another thing I'm taking from this conversation is the importance of the visibility and transparency too. So, one of the things, as Ugochi and Julia have been talking, is just this idea that parents don't have visibility into a lot of this, and particularly, and that tracks along socioeconomic and other forms of privilege. And, one thing that why I've tended to gravitate towards a lot of these informal and out of school environments is that, and I think why parents have this sort of face validity about the value of something like playing baseball or performing music is they also have visibility into those occasions where it's made public and accessible and they're part of it. And I think that was part of the design of the boss level too, is that you bring the parents and communities into those collective endeavors to be judges, to be audience members and things like that. And so these are, we don't think of, you know, the recitals and the football games and the baseball games as assessments, but in a way they are our communal appreciation of what our kids have accomplished. And I think that visibility and transparency across the institutional boundaries is, you know, that's another really important piece of the equity agenda. I feel like that everybody has a place to play in the celebration slash assessment of what kids have accomplished. And too often as parents, we're actually shut out from that, I think, in the school context. I think we're moving close to the end of our hour together. Um, as is customary, I wanted to give each of our guests an opportunity for any last closing statements, and then we'll let Kris and Bill have the final parting words. So I don't know, Lisa, do you want to jump in?
We're saying about the transparency and that these assessments happen in all these different types of activities. I think just bringing it back to what I was saying before about relationships, I think that one of the affordances of new media is the foregrounding the social relationships and the kinds of activities that we do. And I think we, especially for parents to understand and for teachers and students to understand that this is part of their connected learning process. And so to just keep that as part of this visibilization process. And I think that we have some research that show that youth like to keep some of their activities in private spaces. So I think that it's, you know, we have to negotiate this kind of collaboration across the different parties that we want to draw in on for creating these structures that Bill and Kris have been talking about to help people connect their learning. So that might have been a little bit haphazard, but I think that there are all these different avenues to explore in terms of what occurs outside of school, and then also to think about the sort of the goals and the needs of the different parties that come to the table.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Ugochi?
I don't have too much to add, but for me, I love assessment, and that's just me, I'm weird, but I like it. But it's one of those things where I think of assessment more as the goals that we have for our organizations and the individuals that we want to see reach their potential. So it's one of these things where I try to think about, you know, what goals are we setting and what goals do we want to see? And it might not be just the kind of factual stuff that we want kids to recite, so they know something. But it's one of the things of how we want them to enact in the world and kind of that change agent sphere that I think is part of the equity issue, as well as the whole ideal about connected learning, is that learning is not, it's an active, we want it to be active. We don't want it to be kind of a kind of surface feature kind of thing. We want them to kind of engage in their world, and we have all these different ways of interacting with people, like Lisa said about relationships. And so I really think that thinking about new ways of assessing, because those are our goals, we kind of work towards them. In that way, we'll support in the way we teach and the way we interact and how we create these spaces for learning. So I'm excited about that.
Thanks, Ugochi. Julie?
Yeah, I'm just sad that the conversation has to end, but I'm very mindful that we only have a minute. But I do really appreciate, Kris, in particular, the just getting rid of the dichotomy, I think, between informal and formal learning spaces. I really have appreciated that part of this conversation. I think it's really very helpful. So anyway, I'll leave it to you guys. Finish up.
Thanks, Julie. I don't know, Bill, do you want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just build on Lisa's comment and harken back to this idea of, you know, thinking about adults as allies to young people.
Yeah.
And how that really turns the conversation for assessment, both of what teachers are doing or educators in informal settings are doing, as well as what we really ought to be looking at in terms of outcomes for young people. So I think that metaphor is really key, and also Kris's metaphor of movement. So those are my two takeaways from today.
Yes. Yes, I wish we could continue the conversation. I guess just a reminder, this conversation helps me think about that this movement across the city is difficult for all adolescents, right? I mean, leveraging and moving across these spaces is a challenge. But there are additional demands or developmental demands that youth from non-dominant communities have that are layered upon this kind of, shared developmental kind of issue. And I think that's really important to remember because a lot of the forms of support that middle class and more privileged youth have are transparent. And so we want to think about more carefully about what are those forms of support that are there in place that help these youth move and make sense of their lives as they're moving across these things. And they help us think about then what are the additional, right, not deficit, but additional forms of support that we might have to leverage to make sure that all youth have this opportunity to connect learning. And I think the big challenge for us is to think about what does connected learning mean for youth from non-dominant communities who are constantly having to negotiate a whole range of demands, right, in their movement. So I just think these are unanswered questions, important social and empirical questions that we need to keep thinking about.
Great, thanks so much. This has been a fantastic and really thought-provoking discussion, so really appreciate you all engaging. I encourage everybody to continue the conversation. You can use our Connected Learning hashtag on Twitter. You can comment on this webinar, which will be archived shortly, and on the connectedlearning.tv site. And of course, there's also our G+ community for Connected Learning. For the next few weeks, we'll be transitioning to webinars that are leading up to our Digital Media and Learning Conference in Chicago in just a few weeks now, March 14th through 16th. The deadline for early registration is tomorrow, so let me just put in a plug there for everybody to please go online and get that taken care of. Next Thursday, our webinar will be 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time with Nicole Mira and Charlene Ortuno. Again, related to the conference on the topic of youth civic engagement. So thanks again for participating and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.